teenage soldier stands alone on a burning tank destroyer. 6 German Panzers roll toward him through the snow. 250 infantry close in from 3 sides. He weighs barely 100 pounds. He should be dead. But for the next hour, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy will do something so impossible that even the Germans who survive it will refuse to believe a single man held that line. This is the story of the deadliest hour in American military history, and the boy from Texas who became a legend by refusing to fall. The snow fell in lazy spirals across the Alsatian plain, soft and silent, as though the world had not already burned itself to ash. It was January 26, 1945, and the fields outside Holtzwihr, France, lay frozen beneath a blanket of white that stretched unbroken to the tree line. The cold was absolute. It crept through wool and leather, through skin and bone, settling deep in the marrow where no fire could reach. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice in the lungs and made every movement feel like dragging iron chains. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stood at the forward edge of Company B's defensive position, his boots crunching through the crust of snow that had hardened overnight. At 19 years old, he looked even younger, a wisp of a boy barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighing maybe 112 pounds soaking wet. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by months of combat and years of hunger before that. High cheekbones pressed against pale skin. Eyes the color of wet slate stared out from beneath the rim of his helmet, scanning the distant woods where the Germans were massing. He had learned to read terrain the way some men read newspapers. Every fold in the earth, every stand of trees, every depression that might hide a machine gun nest. It all registered in his mind with the instinctive clarity of a hunter who had spent his childhood tracking rabbits through the East Texas brush. But this morning, the landscape offered no comfort. The open fields between his position and the Bois de Redouire were a killing ground, and he knew it. Knew it the way he knew the weight of his M1 carbine, the way he knew the metallic taste of fear that had become as familiar as his own spit. Behind him, the remnants of Company B huddled in hastily dug foxholes along the tree line. 18 men. That was all that remained of the 120 soldiers who had entered the Batavia woods 2 days ago. 18 cold, exhausted, traumatized men who looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and expected to see more. They were kids, most of them. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and shop clerks from Brooklyn who had never fired a gun before the army taught them how. Now they sat in frozen mud, cradling rifles with fingers so numb they could barely feel the triggers, and waited for whatever hell was coming next. Murphy lit a cigarette with hands that trembled. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the cold. The lie was comfortable, familiar. He had been lying to himself about fear for 3 years now, ever since he had stepped off the train in North Africa and realized that war was nothing like the movies. War was blood freezing in the snow. War was the smell of cordite and burned meat and human waste. War was watching your friends die in ways that made you stop believing in God, if you ever had. The field telephone at his feet crackled. Easy Company reports movement in the Bois de Redouire, the voice said. Static chewed at the words. Looks like armor. Multiple vehicles. Infantry in strength. Murphy keyed the handset. Roger. Keep me posted. His voice was flat, emotionless. Command voice. Officer voice. Not the voice of a boy who should have been worrying about girls and graduation, but the voice of a man who had killed so many people he had stopped counting. He glanced back at his men. Some of them were sleeping or trying to. Others stared at nothing, their faces blank with the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing friends evaporated by artillery. Sergeant Kerrigan, a squat Irishman from Boston with a scar across his left cheek, caught Murphy's eye and nodded. No words necessary. They both knew what was coming. The first shell hit 50 yards to the left, a sudden eruption of earth and snow that sent frozen clods tumbling through the air. Then another closer. Then a whole barrage, the German 88s opening up from the woods with that distinctive crack boom that made your intestines clench. Murphy dropped flat, pressing himself into the snow as shrapnel whined overhead. The ground shook with each impact, a steady drumbeat of destruction that went on until it felt like the world was ending one explosion at a time. When the barrage lifted, the silence was worse than the noise. Murphy raised his head slowly, ears ringing, tasting blood where he had bitten his tongue. Smoke drifted across the field in thick gray columns. Through the haze he saw them coming. 6 tanks. Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz 3s. Their hulls painted in winter camouflage that made them look like ghosts emerging from the fog. Behind them came the infantry, an entire battalion it looked like. 250 men or more, advancing in a ragged skirmish line with their rifles at port arms. They wore white snow smocks over their field gray uniforms, and at this distance they looked like an army of wraiths, faceless and inexorable. Murphy's stomach went cold. This wasn't a probe. This wasn't a patrol testing the American lines. This was a full-strength assault designed to punch through Company B's position and roll up the entire defensive line. And there was nothing to stop it. Nothing but 18 exhausted riflemen, a few machine guns, and one skinny lieutenant who weighed less than the ammunition belts his men carried. He grabbed the field telephone. Fire mission. Enemy armor and infantry advancing from the Bois de Redouire. Coordinates. He rattled off the numbers from memory. His voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in his veins. Request immediate fire support. Over. Roger, Lieutenant. Rounds on the way. Estimate 2 minutes to impact. 2 minutes. Murphy watched the panzers grind forward, their tracks chewing through the frozen earth. 2 minutes was an eternity. 2 minutes was enough time for those tanks to close within effective range and start tearing his position apart. 2 minutes was long enough for him to die 100 deaths in his imagination. The M10 tank destroyer sat 30 yards forward of the main line, hull down in a shallow depression that gave it a clear field of fire across the open ground. It was a bastard vehicle, an open-topped Sherman chassis mounting a 76mm gun, powerful enough to kill a panzer if the shot was lucky, but armored like a tin can. The crew had abandoned it earlier when a German shell had damaged the transmission. Now it sat there like a beached whale, useless and alone, except for the .50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun mounted on the turret ring. Murphy stared at that gun. 1,200 rounds per minute. Effective range up to 1,800 meters. A weapon that could shred infantry and chew through light armor if you knew where to aim. It was also completely exposed, mounted on a vehicle that was already a known target, sitting in the open with no cover. Suicide. The thought came to him clearly, matter-of-factly, like someone remarking on the weather. Climbing onto that M10 would be suicide. The Germans would see him instantly. They would concentrate every rifle, every machine gun, every tank cannon on that position. He would be alone, exposed, with no way to retreat and no backup. The vehicle was already leaking fuel. He could smell it from here, a sharp petroleum stink cutting through the cordite smoke. One tracer round in the wrong place and the whole thing would go up like a torch. But from that position, he could direct artillery fire. From that position, he could see the entire German advance and call corrections. From that position, he could use that .50 cal to break up the infantry assault, make the Germans think twice about advancing in the open. From that position, he might buy enough time for his men to withdraw to a better defensive line. Murphy looked back at his 18 soldiers. Boys, really. Most of them had been in combat less than a month. They watched him now with the desperate hope of men who needed someone to tell them what to do, how to survive, how to make sense of the senseless thing that war had become. He made his decision. Fall back to the secondary line, he shouted, his voice cutting through the rising chatter of German machine gun fire. Kerrigan, get them moving. Now. The sergeant stared at him. What about you, Lieutenant? I'll direct fire from the TD. He jerked his chin toward the abandoned M10. Soon as you're clear, I'll follow. Go. Kerrigan's face told Murphy everything he needed to know. The sergeant thought he was insane. Maybe he was right. But Kerrigan was also a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. Yes, sir. He turned and started screaming at the others to move. 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 Murphy didn't watch them go. He was already running forward, bent low, carbine clutched in one hand and field telephone in the other. The snow had been churned to slush by artillery, and his boots splashed through half-frozen puddles that soaked his trousers to the knee. Bullets cracked past his head, making the air snap and hiss. Somewhere a German MG-42 opened up, that insane buzzsaw sound that could cut a man in half at 300 yards. Murphy heard the round's impact behind him, chewing through the earth where he had been standing 2 seconds ago. He reached the M10 and scrambled up the hull. The metal was scorching hot despite the cold. The fire from the damaged engine compartment was still burning, radiating heat that turned the air above the vehicle into a shimmering curtain. Murphy could feel it through his gloves, through his wool uniform, could smell the paint bubbling off the steel plating. The .50 cal waited for him like an old friend. He checked the feed mechanism automatically, his hands moving through the routine they had performed 1,000 times. Belt loaded. Action clear. The gun was hot, the barrel already warm from previous firing. Good. A hot gun was a reliable gun, less likely to jam when you needed it most. Murphy swung the weapon toward the advancing Germans and squeezed the butterfly trigger. The .50 caliber erupted with a sound like the world tearing in half. Recoil hammered through his shoulders, through his spine, rattling his teeth. The gun spat out rounds so fast they blurred into a continuous stream of destruction. Each bullet was half an inch wide and 4 inches long, a piece of jacketed lead traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When those rounds hit human flesh, they didn't wound, they destroyed. They turned men into spray. They snapped bones like dry kindling and carved holes through torsos big enough to put your fist through. Murphy walked his fire across the advancing infantry, watching through the tracers as Germans twisted and fell. The white snow around them turned red, sudden violent splashes of color that spread and merged and froze. Men screamed, though Murphy couldn't hear them over the hammering of the gun. They scattered, diving for cover that didn't exist, trying to make themselves small against bullets that cared nothing for fear or courage or the desperate will to live. A Panzer IV traversed its turret toward him. Murphy saw the barrel swing, saw the muzzle flash, and threw himself flat an instant before the 75mm shell screamed past and exploded somewhere behind him. Shrapnel clanged off the M10's hull like hammers on an anvil. He felt the vehicle shudder beneath him, felt heat bloom from a new fire starting somewhere in the engine compartment. No time to think about that. He hauled himself back to the .50 cal and opened fire again, this time aiming for the infantry clustered behind the lead tank. They went down in clumps, sudden thrashing puppets with their strings cut. The Panzer fired again and missed again, the shell hitting 20 yards to the left and geysering frozen earth into the air. Murphy's world contracted to the gun. Nothing else existed. Not the cold, not the fear, not the rational voice screaming in the back of his mind that he needed to get off this burning wreck before it exploded. There was only the trigger beneath his thumbs, the rhythmic buck of the weapon, the stream of brass casings cascading off the turret ring and bouncing across the hull with a musical tinkling sound that was almost pretty. The Germans kept coming. They had to. Retreating across open ground would be just as deadly as advancing, and at least advancing gave them a chance to close with the Americans and use their superior numbers. So they came on and Murphy killed them. He killed them methodically, dispassionately, with the cold efficiency of a machine. He aimed for clusters of men, for squads trying to maneuver, for officers waving their pistols and shouting orders. He killed sergeants and corporals and privates and couldn't have told you the difference because at 300 yards they all looked the same through a haze of gun smoke. The field telephone crackled. "Lieutenant Murphy? Are you still on that vehicle?" He keyed the handset with one hand while firing with the other. "Affirmative. Adjust fire 200 yards east. They're trying to flank. Sir, you need to get off that TD. It's burning." "I'm aware." Murphy's voice was flat, almost bored. "Fire the goddamn mission." "Roger. Rounds incoming." The first artillery shells arrived like the voice of God. They screamed down from the sky and detonated among the advancing Germans with a sound that made Murphy's ears pop. Orange fireballs blossomed across the snow, each one vaporizing everything within a 20-yard radius. The ground heaved and buckled. Trees at the edge of the Bois de Redouire snapped like matchsticks. Men simply ceased to exist, erased from the world in microseconds of fire and overpressure. But still they came. The Panzers ground forward, turrets traversing as they searched for targets. German machine guns hammered away from positions in the woods, their fire converging on the burning M10 from three sides now. Bullets spanged off the hull, off the turret ring, off the .50 cal's armored shield. Murphy felt the impacts vibrate through his chest like a second heartbeat. One round grazed his helmet, spinning it sideways on his head. Another punched through his left trouser leg without touching skin, leaving a neat hole that immediately began to frost over. He kept firing. The second belt ran dry. Murphy yanked it free, grabbed a fresh belt from the ammo cans mounted on the turret, and slapped it into the feed tray. His hands were shaking now, from cold, from adrenaline, from the sustained muscle strain of controlling the heavy gun. Blood ran down his left hand where the scorching metal had burned through his glove, but he barely felt it. Pain was distant, abstract, something happening to someone else. A German officer, Murphy could tell by the peaked cap, rose from cover and waved his men forward. Murphy swung the .50 cal toward him and held the trigger down. The officer disintegrated in a spray of red mist. The men around him faltered, and Murphy killed them too. Time became elastic. He had no idea how long he had been on the M10. Minutes? Hours? The sun hadn't moved in the sky, but that meant nothing when you were fighting. Seconds stretched into eternities between trigger pulls. An entire lifetime could pass in the space between seeing a target and squeezing the butterfly grips. The heat from the fires was intense now. Murphy's face felt sunburned, tight and raw. His lungs hurt from breathing superheated air mixed with diesel fumes and gun smoke. The ammunition cans were starting to cook off from the heat, individual rounds popping like firecrackers inside the steel containers. If the fire reached the 76mm shells stored in the M10's ammunition racks, the explosion would turn the vehicle and Murphy into a crater. He should retreat. Every survival instinct he had honed over 3 years of combat screamed at him to get off the burning wreck and fall back to the tree line. But the Germans were still out there, still advancing, and if he left the .50 cal unmanned, they would roll right through the gap and hit Company B from two sides. His 18 men wouldn't last 5 minutes. So he stayed. A Sturmgeschütz 3, squat, ugly, lethal, crawled forward through the smoke. Its long 75mm gun swept across the field, searching. Murphy saw the muzzle flash and ducked as the shell screamed overhead, so close he felt the pressure wave. The round exploded in the trees behind him with a sound like thunder. Splinters rained down across his shoulders. He swung the .50 cal toward the assault gun and opened fire on its vision blocks. The heavy rounds sparked off the armored glass, not penetrating but turning the Stooge effectively blind. The vehicle commander popped his hatch to see what was happening, and Murphy put a 3-round burst through his chest. The man folded backward and disappeared inside the turret. Another belt ran dry. Murphy reloaded, his movements now automatic, divorced from conscious thought. His mind had entered that strange fugue state that came sometimes in combat, where everything slowed down and became hyper-real. He could see individual snowflakes drifting past the gun barrel, could count the rivets on the nearest Panzer's hull, could feel his heart beating in his chest, slow and strong, as though his body had decided that panic was a luxury it couldn't afford. The German infantry were close now, maybe 100 yards, close enough that Murphy could see their faces beneath the rims of their helmets. They looked terrified. They looked young. They looked like boys playing at war, just like him, just like everyone else who had been chewed up by this meat grinder called Europe. He killed them anyway. A squad made it within 50 yards before the .50 cal found them. Murphy stitched them from left to right, the bullets hitting with sounds like axes on wood. They crumpled and lay still in the snow, small broken shapes that didn't look human anymore. A grenade exploded near the M10's left track, showering Murphy with frozen dirt and bits of shrapnel. He felt something hot slice across his left thigh, felt blood well up hot and wet inside his trousers. The wound burned, then went numb, then just became another part of the general agony that was his body. The field telephone crackled again. "Lieutenant, we're seeing withdrawal. They're pulling back. Get off that goddamn vehicle before it blows." Murphy looked up from the gun for the first time in how long? 10 minutes? 20? An hour? The German assault had stalled. The infantry were falling back toward the woods in ragged groups, dragging their wounded with them. The Panzers were reversing, black diesel smoke pouring from their exhausts as they disengaged. The snow between Murphy's position and the Bois de Redouire was littered with bodies, dozens of them, black shapes against white ground. He had stopped them. Somehow, impossibly, he had stopped them. Murphy tried to stand and couldn't. His legs wouldn't obey. He looked down and saw blood pooling in his left boot, saw more blood running down his right arm from a wound he didn't remember taking. His gloves were shredded. The leather burned away to reveal raw red flesh beneath. His face felt like it was on fire. The M10 chose that moment to remind him it was dying. A muffled explosion deep in the engine compartment sent flames shooting up through the vents. Black smoke rolled across the turret ring. The heat became unbearable, a physical force that shoved at Murphy like giant invisible hands. He grabbed the field telephone and slid off the hull, landing in the snow with a jarring impact that sent fresh pain screaming through his wounded leg. The cold was a shock after the heat of the burning vehicle, like diving into ice water. Murphy gasped, tasted blood, and started crawling toward the tree line. Every movement was agony. His left leg dragged uselessly behind him, the torn muscles refusing to respond. His hands left bloody prints in the snow. German machine guns opened up again, tracking his movement, bullets kicking up little fountains of slush around him. Murphy didn't care. He was beyond caring. He was beyond fear. He was just meat trying to reach cover before the meat stopped working. Hands grabbed him, Sergeant Kerrigan and another soldier. Murphy couldn't remember his name, hauled him the last 20 yards and dumped him in a foxhole. Murphy lay on his back, staring at the gray sky, breathing in ragged gasps that made his ribs scream. "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant," Kerrigan said. His voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Jesus Christ." Murphy tried to respond and couldn't. His mouth didn't work. Nothing worked. He was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired, more tired than he had ever been in his life. Tired down to the atomic level, tired in his bones and blood and soul. Someone was yelling for a medic. Someone else was wrapping his leg in bandages that immediately turned red. Murphy watched it happen with detached curiosity, as though it were happening to someone else. Maybe it was. Maybe the real Audie Murphy had died back there on that burning tank destroyer, and what lay here in the snow was just an echo, a ghost that didn't know it was dead yet. The M10 exploded. The stored ammunition finally cooked off, and the vehicle came apart in a fireball that sent pieces of burning metal tumbling through the air. The heat washed over Murphy's position, making the snow around him instantly evaporate into steam. He had been standing on that gun less than 30 seconds ago. Murphy started to laugh. He couldn't help it. The absurdity of it all, the impossibility of surviving what he had just survived, hit him like a physical blow, and laughter was the only possible response. He laughed until tears ran down his face, until his ribs hurt worse than his wounds, until Kerrigan grabbed his shoulders and shook him and told him to snap out of it. "Sorry," Murphy gasped. "Sorry, Sergeant. I'm okay." "Like hell you are. You're hit in 3 places and you just spent 20 minutes on a burning tank." "Hour," Murphy corrected. He had no idea if that was true, but it felt right. "Whatever. You're batshit crazy, Lieutenant. You know that?" Murphy nodded. He did know that. Had known it for a while now. You didn't survive 3 years of combat without going a little crazy. The sane ones died early. The field telephone squawked. Murphy reached for it, but his hands were shaking too badly. Kerrigan picked it up instead. "Company B. Yeah, he's alive. Barely. Ah, roger that." He looked at Murphy. "They're sending up a counterattack. Want us to support with fire." Murphy closed his eyes. Every part of him hurt. Every cell in his body screamed for rest, for warmth, for an end to the pain. But the Germans were still out there, still dangerous, still capable of regrouping and coming back. "Tell them we're in," he said. "Where's my carbine?" The long road to Holtzwihr. To understand what happened on that frozen field in Alsace, you have to understand where Audie Murphy came from. You have to understand the poverty, the hunger, the absolute grinding desperation that shaped him long before the army ever pinned sergeant's stripes on his shoulders. He was born June 20th, 1925, in a sharecropper's shack near Kingston, Texas. Hunt County, cotton country, land so poor that even the weeds struggled to grow. His father, Audie Murphy, was a sharecropper who drank away what little money the family had. His mother, Josie, held the family together through sheer force of will, though she was fighting a losing battle against poverty and tuberculosis. There were 12 children in all, though 3 died in infancy. Audie was the 7th. He grew up in a 2-room shack with a dirt floor and holes in the roof where the rain came through. In winter, they stuffed the walls with rags and newspaper to keep out the cold. In summer, the heat was unbearable, turning the shack into an oven that baked them slowly, day after day. They were poor in ways that modern Americans can't comprehend. Not struggling to make ends meet poor. Not ramen noodles for dinner poor. The kind of poor where you ate what you could catch or kill, and if you didn't catch anything, you didn't eat. The kind of poor where shoes were a luxury and your clothes were made from flour sacks. The kind of poor that hollowed you out from the inside, that made you old before you ever got a chance to be young. Audie learned to hunt when he was 5 years old. His father gave him a rusty .22 rifle and told him to bring back meat. It wasn't a game. It wasn't father-son bonding. It was survival. If Audie didn't shoot rabbits or squirrels or whatever else he could find, his brothers and sisters went hungry. So he learned. He learned to move through the brush without making a sound, to read the signs that told him where game would be, to squeeze the trigger with surgical precision because ammunition cost money they didn't have. He learned patience, learned to wait for hours without moving for the perfect shot. By the time he was 8, he could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 yards. These skills, patience, marksmanship, the ability to move unseen, would save his life 200 times over before the war was done. When Audie was 12, his father abandoned the family. Just walked away one day and never came back. Audie Murphy was a failure and a drunk, but he had been a body in the house, an extra pair of hands. Without him, things got worse. Josie Murphy tried to hold it together. She picked cotton until her hands bled, took in washing, did anything she could to feed her children. But tuberculosis was eating her from the inside, turning her lungs to cheese, stealing her strength one day at a time. Audie watched his mother die slowly, watched her cough blood into rags she tried to hide from the children, watched her waste away until she was nothing but skin stretched over bones. She died when Audie was 16. The county tried to take the younger children, scatter them to orphanages and foster homes. Audie wouldn't let them. He quit school. Not that he'd attended much anyway, and took whatever work he could find. He picked cotton. He hauled firewood. He hunted. Somehow, impossibly, he kept the family together. But poverty had marked him permanently. He never grew properly. Years of malnutrition stunted his growth, leaving him barely 5'5" and thin as a rail. His face had the gaunt, hollowed-out look of someone who had gone hungry too many times. His eyes were old, wary, watchful. The eyes of someone who had learned early that the world was a cruel place and mercy was a luxury reserved for people who could afford it. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Audie Murphy saw his way out. Not out of poverty, you couldn't escape poverty in 1940s Texas, but out of the grinding hopelessness that came with it. The military offered steady pay, 3 meals a day, and the chance to be something other than a sharecropper's son who would probably die young and poor and forgotten. He tried to join the Marines. They rejected him. Too short, too skinny, too young. He tried the Paratroopers. Same story. Finally, in June 1942, 3 days after his 17th birthday, he lied about his age and enlisted in the army. They took one look at his gaunt frame and almost rejected him too. But they needed bodies. The war was chewing through men at a terrifying rate, and the army had quotas to fill. So they took him. Private Audie Murphy shipped out for basic training. The other recruits laughed at him. This skinny kid who looked like a strong wind would blow him over, who barely came up to their shoulders, who had probably never been in a real fight in his life. They stopped laughing after he qualified expert with the rifle. Stopped laughing even harder when he started winning every marksmanship competition the training cadre threw at him. What they didn't understand, what nobody understood until much later, was that Murphy wasn't just a good shot. He was something else entirely. something shaped by hunger and desperation and years of hunting to survive. When Murphy looked down a rifle barrel, he didn't see targets. He saw meat. He saw the difference between eating and starving. He saw it with a clarity that most soldiers never achieved, a kind of murderous focus that came from understanding that hesitation meant death. The army sent him to North Africa in February 1943 as a replacement in Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. He was 17 years old, though his record said 18. He weighed 108 pounds with his pack on. His fellow soldiers called him baby and kid, and made jokes about putting him in their rucksacks. Murphy's first combat experience was at Sicily in July 1943. The 3rd Infantry Division came ashore at Licata on the southern coast, wading through chest-deep water under sporadic artillery fire from Italian positions in the hills. Murphy had never seen the ocean before, had never been on a boat before, had never been outside Texas before. Now he was in a foreign country carrying 60 pounds of gear with people trying to kill him. He should have been terrified. He probably was. But Murphy had learned early how to push fear down into a box in his mind and lock it there. So he waded ashore with the others, and when German machine guns opened up from a pillbox overlooking the beach, Murphy did what came naturally. He started shooting back. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. Not the set-piece battles of popular imagination, but close-quarters slaughter in narrow streets and olive groves. Murphy learned that men died in stupid ways. Shot by snipers while taking a piss, blown apart by mines while walking down roads that looked safe, killed by artillery shells that fell from a clear sky without warning. He learned that courage didn't matter much when a bullet could kill a brave man as easily as a coward. He learned that the key to survival was not heroics but simply being somewhere else when the shells landed. At Salerno in September, Murphy killed his first German soldier. Up close, with a rifle, close enough to see the man's face. The German was maybe 20-25. Blonde hair, blue eyes, looking scared and young and not so different from Murphy himself. They saw each other at the same instant. Both raised their rifles and Murphy was faster. The German fell with a neat hole in his chest, and Murphy felt nothing. No remorse, no triunfo, no horror. Nothing. This worried him more than the killing itself. He had expected to feel something. Guilt, satisfaction, anything. But there was just emptiness, a cold mechanical efficiency that clicked into place whenever he squeezed a trigger. Years later, he would describe it as like watching himself from outside his body. A disconnection between the Murphy who pulled triggers and the Murphy who thought and felt and dreamed. The army promoted him to corporal in October 1943. At Anzio in January 1944, where the 3rd Division nearly got cut off and annihilated, they promoted him to sergeant. He was 18 years old and in command of a squad. Baby-faced, barely shaving, giving orders to men twice his age who had learned to trust him because Murphy had a supernatural ability to smell danger before it arrived. At Anzio, Murphy earned his first decoration for valor. His squad was pinned down by a German machine gun nest. Instead of waiting for support, Murphy crawled forward alone through a ditch filled with freezing water and dead bodies. He got within grenade range and threw 2 grenades into the position, then rushed forward and shot the survivors. His platoon sergeant recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross. Murphy didn't think it was a big deal. He had just done what needed doing. The pattern repeated through Italy, through southern France after the invasion in August 1944. Murphy killed Germans. He killed them in farmhouses and forests and city streets. He killed them with rifles, machine guns, grenades, once with a trench knife when his carbine jammed at point-blank range. The army kept promoting him because he kept not dying, which was rare enough to be notable. By January 1945, Murphy had been in combat almost continuously for 18 months. He had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Monte Cassino, the Colmar Pocket, and half a dozen smaller actions that didn't have famous names but had been just as deadly. He had been wounded twice, though never seriously enough to warrant evacuation. He had earned the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross. And he had been promoted to Second Lieutenant at age 19, a battlefield commission granted because all the other officers in Company B kept getting killed and someone had to lead the men. Leadership sat uneasily on Murphy's narrow shoulders. He didn't look like an officer. He still looked like a kid playing dress-up in an army uniform. But the men trusted him because Murphy had a talent that was more valuable than any tactical manual. He could keep them alive. In a war where most infantry replacements died within 2 weeks of arriving at the front, Murphy's Company B had a survival rate that was almost miraculous. His men adored him. They would follow him anywhere because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do first. This was both Murphy's greatest strength and his fatal flaw. He led from the front because that's how he understood leadership. But leading from the front in infantry combat was statistically suicidal. The life expectancy of a junior officer in frontline service was measured in weeks. Murphy had already beaten those odds by months. He was living on borrowed time and everybody knew it. By the time Company B staggered into the frozen forests near Holtzwihr in late January 1945, Murphy was a ghost. He weighed 95 pounds, down from his normal 112. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in days. His hands shook from exhaustion and cold and accumulated adrenaline that had nowhere to go. His eyes were sunken in dark hollows, his face skeletal. The fighting in the Batavir woods had been apocalyptic. 2 days of close-quarters combat in snow and mud against German forces that refused to break. Company B went in with 120 men. They came out with 18. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing, those last being a euphemism for blown to pieces too small to identify. Murphy had watched boys he knew die in those woods, had held some of them while they bled out, whispering lies about how they'd be okay, how the medics were coming, how they'd see home again, had learned to recognize the exact moment when life left a body, when a person stopped being a person and became just meat cooling in the snow. This was the Murphy who stood on that M10 on January 26, 1945. Not a hero, not a warrior, just a supremely damaged 19-year-old boy who had learned that the only way to survive was to become very good at killing, and who couldn't stop even when stopping was the smart thing to do. The counterattack. The morphine kicked in around the same time Murphy stood up. The medic had pumped him full of it, probably more than regulation allowed, and now the world had taken on a dreamy, floating quality. The pain was still there, but distant, like a conversation happening in another room. "Lieutenant, you need to stay down." The medic, PFC Bergman, Murphy remembered, from somewhere in Minnesota, looked worried. "You've lost a lot of blood. I'm fine." Murphy's voice sounded strange to his own ears, slurred slightly around the edges. He picked up his carbine, checked the magazine, let muscle memory guide him through the motions. Kerrigan was organizing the counterattack. 18 men, most of them just as exhausted and shot up as Murphy, preparing to advance into the teeth of a German force that still outnumbered them 10-1. It was insane. It was also necessary. The Germans were pulling back, disorganized, vulnerable. If Company B didn't press them now, they'd dig in at the tree line and the whole bloody process would start over tomorrow. "Radio says armor's coming up," Kerrigan reported. "Should be here in 10 minutes. "We go now," Murphy said, "before they recover." "Sir, you can barely stand." Murphy looked at his sergeant. Really looked at him. Kerrigan was 32, ancient by infantry standards. He had a wife and 2 kids back in Boston. He had every reason to argue, to tell Murphy to sit this one out, to point out that the morphine coursing through Murphy's system made him a liability rather than an asset. Instead, Kerrigan nodded. "Yes, sir. On your command." This was leadership, Murphy thought with drug-addled clarity. Not the crisp salutes and parade ground formality they taught at officer candidate school. Real leadership was convincing men to do impossible things for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. It was trust earned by shared suffering. It was the unspoken understanding that you would all probably die, but at least you'd die together. "Fix bayonets," Murphy said. His voice carried across the position, cutting through the rattle of distant machine gun fire. "On me." They fixed bayonets. The steel blades caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky, turning 18 men into 18 points of cold metal determination. Murphy could see the fear in their eyes. They weren't stupid. They knew this was crazy. But he could also see something else. Trust. Faith. The insane belief that if Audie Murphy said they could do it, then somehow they could. Murphy climbed out of the foxhole. His left leg nearly buckled, but he caught himself and kept moving. Behind him, he heard his men emerging from cover, spreading into a skirmish line. 18 rifles, 2 Browning automatic rifles, 1 morphine-addled lieutenant with a death wish. The German withdrawal had stalled at the edge of the Bois de Redouire. Murphy could see them through the smoke and snow, small groups of soldiers trying to organize a defensive position. Officers were shouting, gesticulating. Machine guns were being set up on hasty tripods. In another minute they'd be dug in, and Company B's attack would turn into a suicide charge. Murphy started running. It wasn't much of a run, more of a limping jog that jarred his wounds with every step. But it was movement, it was aggression, and aggression was what mattered now. The Germans saw him coming and hesitated, that fatal fraction of a second where surprise overrode training. How could the Americans be counterattacking? The Americans should be dead, shattered, running for their lives. Instead here came this tiny officer, moving like a ghost through the snow, carbine at his shoulder. Murphy fired on the move, snapping off shots at targets of opportunity. A German soldier trying to set up a machine gun. Another running for cover. A third turning to bring his rifle to bear. All 3 went down, neat holes drilled through center mass. Murphy's hands were steady, his aim perfect, the endless hours spent hunting rabbits in East Texas paying dividends in human blood. His men came behind him, spreading out, adding their fire to his. The Germans broke. Not slowly, not in good order, but catastrophically. A sudden collapse that sent them streaming back into the woods. They abandoned weapons, abandoned wounded comrades, abandoned everything in their desperation to escape these crazy Americans who refused to die. Company B swept forward, shooting Germans who tried to surrender, shooting Germans who tried to fight, shooting Germans who were just trying to run. It was slaughter, but Murphy felt nothing. The morphine and the adrenaline and the accumulated trauma had merged into a cold, mechanical clarity. He was a machine that processed targets into corpses, nothing more. They reached the tree line. Murphy leaned against a pine tree and tried to remember how to breathe. His leg was bleeding again, fresh red soaking through the bandages. His vision swam, doubling and tripling before resolving back to normal. Kerrigan appeared beside him, grabbing his arm to steady him. "Jesus, Lieutenant. We did it. We actually did it." Murphy nodded. Words seemed too difficult. The world was tilting sideways, and he couldn't tell if that was the morphine or blood loss or just exhaustion finally catching up with him. Engines rumbled in the distance. American armor, grinding forward to consolidate the position. Too late to matter, but present enough to claim credit. That was the Army way. Murphy didn't care. He slid down the tree trunk and sat in the snow, carbine across his lap, and watched his men secure the perimeter. 18 soldiers had just routed a German battalion. It shouldn't have been possible. By every rule of warfare, by every calculation of combat power and force ratios, Company B should have been annihilated in the first 5 minutes of the German assault. Instead they were here, alive, victorious, staring at each other with the stunned disbelief of men who had just witnessed a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle, Murphy thought. It was just death on an industrial scale, delivered with the kind of precision that came from years of desperation and hunger. The Germans had run into something they didn't understand. A boy from East Texas who was willing to burn alive rather than retreat, because retreat meant failure, and failure meant going back to being poor and powerless and nothing. Better to die on a burning tank destroyer than go back to that. The medics found him eventually. Bergman and another man whose name Murphy had forgotten. They loaded him onto a stretcher despite his protests, carried him back through the snow to an aid station that smelled of ether and gangrene. "You're going to the rear," Bergman said firmly. "No arguments, sir. You've got shrapnel wounds, burns, and you've lost enough blood to fill a canteen." Murphy wanted to argue, wanted to stay with his men, his Company B, the only family he had left. But his body had other ideas. Consciousness was slipping away like water through his fingers, and he was too tired to hold on to it. His last thought before the darkness took him was simple, almost mundane. "I wonder if they'll remember me." Aftermath and legend. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy didn't die on that frozen field in Alsace. Sometimes, in the years that followed, he wondered if that had been a mistake. He spent 2 weeks in a hospital recovering from his wounds. The burns healed. The shrapnel wounds closed. The blood loss was replaced through transfusions that left him feeling weak and distant from his own body. The doctors told him he was lucky. Murphy nodded and said nothing, because how do you explain to a doctor that luck is just another word for surviving when everyone else didn't? On June 2, 1945, in a ceremony at the French Riviera, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Audie Murphy with the Medal of Honor. The citation read like something from a novel, because the truth was too improbable for anyone to believe without embellishment. It spoke of gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned the 6 tanks and estimated 250 soldiers. It described Murphy's lone stand on the burning M10. What it didn't mention was the look in Murphy's eyes as he received the medal. The emptiness there. The 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much, surviving too much, killing too much. Murphy was 20 years old and looked 40. The war had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with wrinkles or gray hair. He ended the war as the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Medal of Honor. Distinguished Service Cross. Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster. Legion of Merit. Bronze Star with V device and Oak Leaf Cluster. Purple Heart with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters. And dozens more French, Belgian, medals from countries that no longer existed, medals that represented blood and terror and moments of sheer insanity that Murphy could never quite bring himself to talk about. 28 medals in total. More decorations than any other American soldier in the war. And Murphy wore them all with a kind of quiet bewilderment, as though he couldn't quite understand why people made such a fuss. After the war, Murphy tried to go home. Back to Texas, back to Hunt County, back to the poverty he had escaped. But you can't go home after something like that. The boy who had left in 1942 was dead, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more damaged. Murphy lasted 3 months in Texas before the walls started closing in. Hollywood found him by accident. A magazine photograph of America's most decorated soldier, looking impossibly young and photogenic despite the hollowness in his eyes. An agent reached out, offered him a contract, promised him money and fame and all the things Murphy had never had growing up. He took it, not because he wanted to be a movie star, but because the alternative was going back to sharecropping, and Murphy would rather have died. His film career was strange, uneven, occasionally brilliant. He made 44 movies between 1948 and 1969, most of them forgettable westerns where he played cowboys and gunslingers. But in 1955 he made To Hell and Back, a film adaptation of his autobiography, playing himself, recreating his own wartime experiences for the camera. Watching Murphy play Murphy is an unsettling experience. He moves through the film with the mechanical precision of a man who has performed these actions so many times that they're encoded in his muscle memory. When he fires a rifle, there's no acting involved, that's just Audie Murphy shooting the way he's been shooting since he was 5 years old. When he looks at dead bodies, the expression on his face isn't manufactured for the camera. That's what Murphy's face actually looked like when confronted with death. Blank, emotionless, carved from stone. The film made him famous, made him wealthy, made him into something he had never wanted to be, a symbol of American courage, of the heroic individual standing against impossible odds, of all the myths and legends that America needed to tell itself about World War II. But Murphy was drowning. The war had broken something fundamental inside him, and fame couldn't fix it. He suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then just called shell shock or battle fatigue or, more often, nothing at all. Real men didn't talk about psychological wounds. Real men just dealt with it. Murphy dealt with it badly. He slept with a loaded .45 automatic under his pillow because he couldn't feel safe without it. He woke up screaming from nightmares where he was back in the Battalion woods, back on that burning M10, back in all the places where men died and he survived. He couldn't hold relationships, couldn't trust people, couldn't believe that anything good could last because his experience had taught him that everything good eventually got blown to pieces. He self-medicated with sleeping pills, with alcohol, with anything that would quiet the noise in his head. He gambled away fortunes. He made poor business decisions. He invested in schemes that collapsed. By the late 1960s, the money from his film career was gone, replaced by debt and desperation. Murphy tried to talk about it, tried to be honest about what war did to soldiers, about how the heroes everyone celebrated were often just damaged men trying to figure out how to live with what they'd done. He gave interviews where he discussed his PTSD, his nightmares, his addiction to sleeping pills. In 1968, he testified before Congress about the need for better mental health care for veterans. The country mostly ignored him. America in the late 1960s was tearing itself apart over Vietnam, and nobody wanted to hear about the psychological cost of war from a World War II hero. Murphy was a relic, a symbol from a simpler time when wars were just and heroes were uncomplicated. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a private plane in Atlanta, bound for Virginia. The weather was bad, thunderstorms, poor visibility, but the pilot took off anyway. 20 minutes later, the plane crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. Murphy was 45 years old. He died broke, his bank accounts empty, his future uncertain. But he died famous, and fame meant that thousands of people attended his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. Presidents sent condolences. The media covered it like the death of a head of state. What they didn't cover, what nobody talked about, was the quiet tragedy of Murphy's post-war life. The way he had survived impossible combat only to be slowly destroyed by the memories of it. The way America had celebrated him as a hero but offered nothing to help him heal. The way he had spent 26 years trying to outrun January 26, 1945, and never quite managed it. Why it matters. The story of Audie Murphy at Holtzwihr is famous because it's dramatic. A lone soldier stopping an entire German battalion makes for great cinema, great storytelling, great mythology. But that's not why it matters. It matters because Murphy was nobody. A sharecropper's son from East Texas who should have died poor and forgotten. A kid so small and malnourished that multiple branches of the military rejected him. Someone the world had written off before he ever got a chance to prove himself. And yet, when the moment came, when history presented him with a choice between survival and sacrifice, Murphy chose to stand. Not because he was fearless. His hands shook, his stomach churned. He knew exactly how likely he was to die on that burning M10. He chose to stand because his men were behind him, and Murphy had learned in the hard school of poverty that you don't abandon your own. The Germans who survived the assault at Holtzwihr told stories about it for years afterward. Stories about the American demon who wouldn't die, who stood on a burning vehicle and killed an entire company by himself. Some of them never believed it was just one man. The human mind rebels against that kind of impossibility. It must have been a machine gun nest. Must have been a whole platoon. Couldn't have been one skinny kid with a Browning M2. But it was. Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr lasted approximately 1 hour, though estimates vary. In that hour, he killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers. The official citation says 50 or more, but survivors suggested the number was higher. He directed artillery fire that killed dozens more. He single-handedly disrupted a battalion-strength assault that should have broken through American lines and turned the entire battle. Military historians still study Holtzwihr as an example of how individual courage can change the outcome of battles. The U.S. Army uses it in leadership training. Foreign militaries have analyzed Murphy's actions, trying to understand what combination of skill, determination, and sheer insanity allowed him to achieve what he did. But Murphy himself never thought it was that remarkable. In interviews later in life, he would shrug and say he just did what needed doing. That anyone in his position would have done the same. That he wasn't a hero, just a soldier who got lucky more times than he had any right to expect. This was both true and false. Murphy was right that he got lucky. Bullets missed him by inches, shells exploded too close and somehow didn't kill him. The M10 held together just long enough for him to abandon it. But luck alone doesn't explain Holtzwihr. Thousands of soldiers got lucky in World War II. Most of them didn't stand alone against battalion-strength attacks. What Murphy had, what separated him from every other soldier in Company B, was an absolute inability to quit. A stubbornness born of years of survival against impossible odds. When you've spent your childhood one missed meal away from starvation, when you've watched your mother die of tuberculosis because the family couldn't afford medicine, when you've held your family together through sheer force of will, then standing on a burning tank destroyer doesn't seem that impossible. It's just another problem that needs solving, another obstacle that needs overcoming, another day of refusing to accept defeat. Murphy carried that refusal with him for the rest of his life. Through Hollywood, through financial ruin, through decades of PTSD that would have broken a lesser person. He kept standing, kept fighting, kept moving forward because that's what you did when the alternative was giving up. And Murphy had learned early that giving up meant death. His grave at Arlington National Cemetery is the second most visited grave site there, after John F. Kennedy's. Thousands of people come every year to pay their respects to the small-town boy who became America's most decorated soldier. They leave flowers, flags, letters thanking him for his service. Many of them weren't born until decades after Murphy died. They come anyway, drawn by something in his story that resonates across generations. Maybe it's the underdog narrative. America loves stories about nobodies who become somebodies. Murphy embodies that myth perfectly, the poor kid who makes good through courage and determination. But maybe it's something deeper. Maybe Murphy matters because he represents the uncomfortable truth that heroism isn't glamorous or glorious. It's painful and traumatic and leaves scars that never fully heal. Murphy survived the war but spent the rest of his life trying to survive the peace. And in that struggle, he was far more representative of the veteran experience than any parade or medal ceremony ever acknowledged. Every year on January 26th, a small group of historians and military enthusiasts gather at Holtzwihr to commemorate the battle. The M10 is long gone, of course, scrapped for metal in the post-war years. But there's a memorial there now, a simple stone marker in a field that looks much the same as it did in 1945. Still flat, still exposed, still the kind of place where anyone with sense would refuse to stand alone. The locals tell stories about Murphy. Some of them are true. Some are embellished. A few are complete fabrications. It doesn't matter. The real story is impossible enough that embellishment is unnecessary. On January 26, 1945, a 95-pound soldier stood on a burning wreck and held a line that should have broken. He killed 50 men, wounded dozens more, and disrupted an assault that would have changed the course of the battle. He did this while wounded, while under fire from three sides, while standing on ammunition that could have exploded at any second. And when it was over, when the Germans had retreated and the Americans had counterattacked and the line had held, Murphy climbed down from that burning M10 and asked if anyone had a cigarette. Because that's what you did. You did the job. You survived. And then you moved on to the next impossible thing. That's the lesson of Audie Murphy, if there is one. Not that war is glorious. Not that violence solves problems. Not that one man can change history. The lesson is simpler, harder, more uncomfortable. Sometimes you have to stand alone. Sometimes you have to do the impossible thing, even when every rational instinct screams at you to run. Sometimes you have to refuse to quit, refuse to break, refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only logical outcome. Murphy stood because someone had to stand, because his men were behind him and they needed time to withdraw, because giving up meant letting the Germans break through, and Murphy had spent his entire life learning that giving up was not an option. He stood, and by standing he became immortal. Not in the sense of living forever. Murphy died at 45, broken by the very war that made him famous. But immortal in memory, in story, in the lessons that each generation takes from his example. The boy from Texas who learned to shoot squirrels to feed his family. The soldier who weighed less than his ammunition load. The man who stood on a burning vehicle and refused to die. The hero who spent his entire life trying to escape the memories of the day he became a hero. That was Audie Murphy. Flawed, damaged, impossibly brave. A reminder that heroes are just people pushed beyond their limits, and that surviving those moments doesn't mean the story has a happy ending. It just means you get to carry the weight a little longer. If you found this story as powerful as I did while researching it, please consider subscribing to our channel. Hit that like button. It helps us create more documentary content like this. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think drove Audie Murphy to stand alone on that burning tank destroyer when every instinct, every ounce of common sense, told him to retreat? Was it duty? Was it the desperation of poverty transformed into stubbornness? Was it simply that he couldn't imagine another way? Share your thoughts below. And remember, heroes aren't born. They're forged in moments when the choice is between standing or running, and somehow, impossibly, they choose to stand. Thanks for watching.